Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, everyone. I hope everyone is good and doing absolutely all right. In the previous session, we discussed about the risk assessment, and we tried understanding that what are the basics of risk assessment and how risks can be assessing the risk and mitigating the risk can be important for any of the ventures. Uh, it is very important that the risk should be assessed and mitigated appropriately and analyzed. In the previous lecture, we saw a life cycle of the risk analysis, in which we actually did our first two parts, which is basically your establishment of the context, as well as identifying the risks. In this identification of the risks, we actually saw the Ishikawa diagram or root cause analysis diagram, in which we understood that how can the 20% of the problems can actually cause 80% of the problems, and if we identify those 20% of the problems, we can actually resolve the rest of the 80% problems. Similarly, we understood that having a good network amongst the internal and the external stakeholders can actually update us with the possible and the potential risks, whereas we can also monitor and review in parallel. So this network, when we actually communicate with the network, which is with the internal and the external stakeholders, we can actually communicate with them and we can actually consult with them. Similarly, when we actually see any potential risks, we monitor and review continuously at every step of the way through our project life cycle, and we can actually assess those risks and analyze and evaluate them, and then later on treat them. And after the treatment, we can monitor if uh, uh, we do have any further risks of the similar type or not. That is the reason why this arrow is actually going towards this side. Now, in the previous lecture, we had actually done these parts, which is rather we did the four parts. The first two parts, which is establishing the context, when we understood what a context is, and then we saw that how can we identify the risk, and we also understood the communication and the monitoring and review part. In this lecture, what we are going to do is we are going to quickly see that how can we analyze the risks and how can we evaluate the risks, and then we can actually treat them, and then again back to the same loop. Okay, moving onwards, in order to actually analyze and evaluate the risks, we need to understand that the risk is actually the product of consequences and likelihood. These consequences are basically, or we can say likelihood or consequences and likelihood. It's basically probability and impact. So the consequences is basically the impact, so we can actually state it as I, whereas the likelihood is basically the probability. Now this likelihood is the probability of occurrence, the probability of occurrence of any risk, and the consequence or the impact is basically for against each risk, how can that risk impact or can have an impact on our venture or can have an impact on our project, whatever we are doing. So what we are going to do is we are going to actually make a P&I matrix, which is probability cross I is for impact, right? And we're going to see that how this probability and the impact can actually categorize the potential risks that we have. And we can see that with this P&I matrix, we can actually categorize between the high amount of the risks, the medium risks, and the low level risks. This actually gives us a very good picture that which risks we should be actually catering first, or we should be actually resolving first, and we should actually be able to get a very good picture that which risks may have a very high impact and they should be actually dealt immediately. So the risk analysis has three steps. One is basically define probability, impact, and the scope. Then they organize the risks and highlight the significant risks. Now, when we talk about defining the classes of the risks, we can actually define the probability and the impact and the risk scope, all three of them. So basically probability, impact, and the risk score. When we talk about the probability, it's basically the probability goes with a very low, low, moderate, high, and very high. Whereas the impact actually goes with a negligible, low, moderate, severe, and catastrophic. And when we talk about the risk score, it is low, medium, and high. Now this is where our P&I matrix gets completed, and we get a very clear picture that which risk is high, which risk is medium, and which risk is low. So moving onwards, first thing that we need to do is we need to actually give this probability. This is basically a simple chart, or this is a mapping chart. The very low category of the risk has to be quantified with 0.1, and on the scale it is 1. Then the uh, low risk is 0.3. On the scale, it can be actually categorized, or it can be quantified as 2. Then moderate is 0.5. It should be moderate, not moderate. 0.5 and 3. High is 0.7 and 4. Then very high is 0.9 and 5. So this actually gives a very good scale for the probability. Now this whole scale over here, this scale is for the probability, and this scale over here is for the impact. So for the impact, we can actually make the scale of negligible, low, moderate, severe, and catastrophic, just as discussed over here, that we have a scale over here for negligible, low, moderate, severe, and catastrophic. Now over here, what we have done is we have actually tried quantifying it, and we have developed it as a chart, or we have actually made a scale out of it. And we can now quantifiably say that very low is 1, and negligible is also 1, whereas very high is 5, and catastrophic is also 5. And it all depends upon the probability, and it all depends upon how much severe impact one can have because of that risk. Moving onwards, now it's time to list down all the risks. I will personally suggest you that what you do is you list down all the risks that you might have in an order, and you actually list down like that. For example, in this section, we have organizational financial problems, force reduction in project budget. So the probability of this risk of happening is low. And this, because the probability of the occurrence of this risk is low, the effect might be negligible, right? Now, it totally depends whether if the probability is low, it's not necessary that the effect should also be negligible. It can also be high. Over here, it is impossible to recruit the staff with the skills required for the project. The probability is over here is high, and the effect over here is moderate. Now, this is basically the probability of occurrence, and this is the impact on the project. Similarly, key staff are ill at critical times. Now, over here, the probability is moderate, but the impact on your project is actually low. Now, if you look at this one, software components that should be reused contain defects which limit their functionality. Now, over here, the probability of occurrence of this risk is low, but if it occurs, the impact on the project is severe over here, right? So it totally depends that how do you evaluate each and every risk. So I would strongly recommend you that you list down all the risks, and once the risks are all the risks are listed down, you should actually define the probability and the effect, the probability of occurrence of that particular risk, and the impact of that risk on your project or your venture, right? So list down all the risks, and then once you have actually listed all the risks down, what you should do is you should actually also serial number them. For example, this is R1, right? And this is R2. It's not listed down over here, but we are going to actually see that we are going to actually use this R1, R2, R3 in the upcoming slides, right? So let's assume this is your risk 1, which is R1, R2, and this is your risk 3, which is R3, right? And so on and so forth. Just keep on going through all the risks over here up till I don't know how many risks are listed over here. Uh, Now, once you have actually identified these risks, like probability is low and negligible. Now, according to the scale given over here, the low is 2 and negligible over here is 1. So when you say that you have low risk and negligible consequences, then we actually quantify this R1 over here as 2 and 1, right? Because 2 over here is your 2 over here is low and negligible, and we have over here is low and negligible, right? So I hope this is pretty much understandable. Similarly, when we talk about the R2, we have 4 and 3, because 4 over here according to this scale is high and 3 over here is moderate, right? So when we actually say the high and moderate, right? So when we can do is we can actually quantify this like this. Same is the case with the R3, right? So R1, R2, R3. Once we have actually quantified, which I also believe that you should quantify your all the risks. But if you don't want to quantify, if you want to go with this particular scheme where only high and severe and very low it's written, you can also actually go ahead with this. It's time to actually develop the matrix. Now, once we actually have quantified, and once we have listed down all the risks, and we have identified that which risk is, what is the probability of the occurrence of each of the risks, and what is the potential impact of each of the risks, we can do is we can actually draw this one simple matrix, which is basically the impact and the likelihood. Now, remember, the impact actually comes at the top on the x-axis, whereas the likelihood actually comes on the y-axis like this, right? And you should always start with the negligible, low, moderate, severe, catastrophic. Whereas over here on the likelihood y-axis, it is very high, high, moderate, low, and very low, right? And if you can see, we have actually placed this each of the risks over here, whereas our first risk R1, if you recall, our R1 was 2 and 1. Now 2 was low and 1 was negligible, right? So what we are going to do is we can actually see the low over here, which is the likelihood, right? And then negligible over here. So this is basically R1. We are going to actually put this risk over here, which is R1, right? Okay. So let me actually make it more clear. It's more clear. This is R1, right? So R1 was with the probability of occurrence, its probability of occurrence was low and its impact was negligible. Similarly, when we actually listed down our R2, which was risk 2, it was high and moderate. High probability of occurrence and moderate probability of moderate impact, right? So, or in other words, it was 4 and 3. So what we can do is we can actually find out uh, this R2, high probability of occurrence and moderate impact. So we're going to put R2 over here. Similarly, R3, see, and our R3 was, if we just go back, our R3 was moderate and low. So moderate is the probability of occurrence. So moderate is the probability of occurrence and low is the impact. Similarly, what we can do is we can actually list down all the risks over here and we can, according to the perception of yours, that what is the likelihood of occurrence of each of the risks and what impact each of the risks might carry, right? So we can actually put all the risks over here in this matrix. Once it is done, just draw the line over here in the middle, right? Just like this. So anything above this goes towards high, anything below this goes towards low, anything coming onto the line is actually a medium. So once we do it, we get this. So anything which is listed over here in the red is actually a high risk. Anything which is listed over here in the green is the low risk. and anything listed over here in the orange is actually the medium risk. Now we can actually see that based on the probability of occurrence of any of the risks and the impact, this product has actually given us this matrix which can actually tell us that what risks might be there residing with us within our project, which should be actually resolved first. So if I'm looking into this P&I matrix, and if I'm looking into this scenario, R5, R6, R7, R8, R13, and R2, they need to be dealt first, because they can actually prove to be, especially R5, they can prove to be especially very high risks, and they have to be dealt with as soon as possible. And then there is a priority of R3, R12, R11, and R4, and then R1, R9, R10, and R14. So this is basically the P&I matrix through which we can actually categorize our potential risks as high, medium, and low. When we go through the project life cycle, this project life cycle generally has in the beginning of any of the projects, the chances and the occurrence of the risks are very high. If you look over here, but over the period of time, over the project life cycle, the amount of the risks and the chances of risks to occur actually goes low. Whereas initially you don't spend too much amount of the money or too much cost on the resolution of these risks, but over the period of time when you actually are dealing with dealing with the amount of the risks in the project life cycle, by the middle and the end of the project life cycle, the cost bearing of these risks increases, right? So this is generally what happens. This is the reason why generally it is said that one should always have a contingency plan. Now, the contingency plan generally is the plan B in very short terms. It's a plan B. And for everything, you should have a plan B because you cannot exactly preempt the situation. You cannot preempt, for example, the external factors, like if the government imposes more taxations, if there is any other external factor which is actually influencing on your project, you need to have actually a contingency plan. You need to have a plan B through which you can actually resolve the issue. So you cannot. One thing you should always remember is that you cannot finish the risks. You can only minimize the risks. So these risks can also increase over the period of time when there is something external force or the internal force comes up, and it gives you a little bit of a problem. Just like I gave you an example of the taxation, right? So you have to include that in your cash flows anyhow. So that is it for this lecture, right? So I hope you understand how to actually analyze and take care of the risks and develop the P&I matrix and identify the high risks potentially. Once it is done, I hope that if this thing is clear, if you have any queries, just let me know. And there'll be a session on Thursday by 10 a.m. You can ask the queries in that session as well. All right, till that time, bye-bye, Allah Hafiz, and take very good care of yourselves.